He was blessed by God with impossible strength, born to be a hero who would save his people. But his greatest enemy wasn't the army he could defeat with his bare hands. It was the weakness in his own heart. This is the tragic story of how God's strongest man was brought down, not by a foreign king, but by his own desires, and how his final moments would shake an empire to its very foundations. To get the story of Samson, you first have to understand the world he was born into. It was a dark and desperate time for the Israelites. For 40 long years, they had been under the thumb of the Philistines, a powerful and technologically advanced people who controlled the coastal plains. The Philistines were a constant threat, a warlike culture with iron chariots and a fierce devotion to their pagan gods, especially a deity named Dagon. The Book of Judges describes this period as a grim, repeating cycle. The people of Israel would turn from God to worship idols. As a result, God would allow an oppressor, like the Philistines, to dominate them. In their suffering, the people would cry out for a deliverer. Then God, in his mercy, would raise up a charismatic leader to save them. But after the judge died, the people would forget, and the whole cycle would start over. It was in this climate of oppression and spiritual decay that our story begins. In the small town of Zorah, a man named Manoah lived there with his wife, who was unable to have children. In their culture, this was a source of deep shame and private grief. Then the impossible happened. An angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife with a message that would change everything. "You are barren and childless." The angel said, "But you are going to become pregnant and give birth to a son." The news was a miracle, but it came with sacred, binding instructions. This child was to be set apart for God from the moment of his conception. He was to be a Nazirite for life. The Nazirite vow was a serious act of dedication to God. Usually, it was a vow someone took voluntarily for a limited time. But this child's vow was to be lifelong, mandated by God before he was even conceived. The rules were strict. First, he was never to drink wine or any other fermented drink, or even eat anything from the grapevine. This symbolized a rejection of worldly pleasures. Second, he was never to touch a dead body, animal or human. This rule emphasized a commitment to life and purity, keeping him separate from the corruption of death. And third, the most famous rule, a razor was never to touch his head. His hair was to grow freely as a public sign of his dedication to good down, the sign of the divine power that would flow through him. This child, the angel declared, would begin the deliverance of Israel from the Philistines. Overwhelmed, Manoah's wife rushed to tell her husband. Manoah, a man of faith, prayed that the angel might return to teach them how to raise the boy. God heard his prayer. The angel appeared again to both of them and repeated the sacred instructions. In awe, Manoah and his wife prepared a sacrifice. As the flames from the altar rose toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended in the fire. They fell on their faces, realizing they had been in the presence of God in time. The woman gave birth to a son, and they named him Samson. The Bible tells us that the boy grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him. A divine power was awakening in a child who carried the hopes of a nation, bound by a holy vow he had not chosen, but which would define his entire life. Asterisk, Samson grew into a man, and the Spirit of the Lord began to manifest in astonishing ways. His power wasn't about muscle or training. It was a divine anointing that would rush upon him in moments of need, turning an ordinary man into a force of nature. The first recorded display of this power was as sudden as it was shocking. The story kicks off with Samson on his way to the Philistine town of Timnah. He wasn't there for war. He was there for a woman. He had seen a young Philistine woman and, captivated, demanded of his parents, "Get her for me as a wife." His parents were horrified. "Isn't there a woman among our own people you can marry?" They pleaded. Marrying a Philistine, an outsider and an oppressor, went against custom and fate. But Samson wouldn't budge. "Get her for me," he insisted. "She's the one I want." The text gives us a crucial insight here. This was from the Lord, who was looking for an opportunity to move against the Philistine. God was about to use Samson's own misguided passions to ignite a conflict. On the journey to Timnah, a young lion came roaring towards Samson. He had no weapon, no time to think. In that moment, the scripture says, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and with his bare hands he tore the lion apart as if it were a young goat. It was a breathtaking display of raw, supernatural power. Yet, he kept it a secret, not even telling his parents. This set a pattern. Samson's strength was divine, but his actions were impulsive and often hidden. Later, on his way to the wedding, he passed the lion's carcass and found something remarkable. A swarm of bees had made a hive inside it, and it was filled with honey. Ignoring the Nazirite vow that forbade contact with a dead body, he scooped out the honey with his hands and ate it. He even gave some to his parents, carefully hiding where he got it from. This was the first clear breach of his sacred vow, a small compromise, maybe, but a major crack in the foundation of his calling at his 7-day wedding feast, which likely involved wine. Another violation of his vow. Samson's arrogance took over. He posed a riddle to his 30 Philistine companions. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. He bet 30 sets of fine clothes that they couldn't solve it in 7 days. Days went by, and the Philistines were stumped. As the deadline loomed, they got angry and desperate. They turned to Samson's new wife with a chilling threat. "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle, or we will burn you and your father's household to death." Terrified, she turned her tears on Samson. Day after day, she wept. "You hate me. You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." The pressure was relentless. The scripture says she pressed him daily until he was vexed to death. Finally, on the 7th day, he broke. He told her the riddle's secret. She immediately betrayed him, giving the answer to the Philistine men. Just before sunset, they came to Samson with a smug reply. "What is sweeter than honey? And what is stronger than a lion?" Samson knew instantly he'd been betrayed. A cold fury rose in him. "If you had not plowed with my heifer," he snarled, "you would not have solved my riddle." Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him again. He went down to the Philistine city of Ashkelon, a major stronghold, and single-handedly struck down 30 of their men. He took their belongings and threw the clothes at the feet of those who had solved the riddle. Consumed by rage, he abandoned his new wife and stormed back to his father's house. But it didn't end there. When Samson's anger cooled, he went back for his wife. only to be told her father had given her to Samson's best man. This was an insult Samson could not bear. His personal grievance was about to become a national catastrophe for the Philistines. This time, he declared, "I will be blameless in retaliating." His plan was as bizarre as it was destructive. He somehow managed to catch 300 foxes or, perhaps, jackals. He tied them in pairs by their tails and fastened a torch between each pair. He lit the torches and released the terrified animals into the ripe Philistine grain fields. The fire spread with terrifying speed, destroying everything: the harvested grain, the standing crops, the vineyards, and the olive groves. It was mass agricultural sabotage. The enraged Philistines investigated and learned. Samson did it because his father-in-law gave his wife away. Their response was brutal. They went and burned Samson's former wife and her father to death, the very thing they had threatened her with. This news only fueled Samson's cycle of vengeance. It was now a blood feud. "Since you've acted like this," he vowed, "I won't stop until I've taken my revenge." He attacked them again, ruthlessly and with a great slaughter. He was no longer just a man with a personal problem. He had become a solitary weapon of mass destruction against the enemies of Israel. After his brutal assault, Samson retreated to a cave at the rock of Etam. He was a lone warrior. His own countrymen saw him not as a deliverer, but as a dangerous liability who was poking a giant. The Philistines, reeling from his attacks, gathered an army and marched into Judah, demanding Samson be handed over. Terrified, the men of Judah sent 3,000 of their own people to confront him. "Don't you realize the Philistines rule over us?" They accused him. "What have you done to us?" Samson's reply was simple and cold. "I only did to them what they did to me." But the men of Judah weren't there to debate justice. They were there to surrender their champion. "We've come to tie you up and hand you over," they told him. Samson, who could have easily overpowered all 3,000, showed a moment of surprising restraint. He agreed to go, but only if they swore not to kill him themselves. They bound him tightly with 2 new ropes and delivered their shackled judge to his enemies. As the Philistines saw him approaching, helpless and bound, they began to shout in triumph. Their celebration was cut short at that very moment. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson with overwhelming power. The 2 new ropes on his arms became like scorched flax. They melted away from his hands. He was free. Looking around, he saw the fresh jawbone of a donkey on the ground. It was an unclean object from a dead animal, another violation of his Nazirite vow. But in that moment, it was all he needed. He grabbed the jawbone and charged into the Philistine army. What followed was a massacre. He swung the jawbone with relentless, supernatural force. Men fell before him like wheat. When the dust settled, 1,000 Philistine soldiers lay dead. Standing amidst the carnage, Samson boasted, "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have killed 1,000 men." But the fight had left him exhausted and desperately thirsty. He cried out to God not in praise, but in complaint. "You have given your servant this great victory," he prayed. "Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" Even then, God showed him mercy. A hollow place in the ground opened up, and water gushed out. Samson drank, and his strength returned. This victory solidified his legend as Israel's fearsome judge. For the next 20 years, he led Israel, a period of relative quiet as the Philistines were now wary of provoking him. But the conflict in his character was always there. The narrative picks up with him going to Gaza, a major Philistine capital deep in enemy territory. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to visit a prostitute, his desires once again leading him straight into danger. The men of Gaza were alerted. Samson is here. They surrounded the place and lay in wait at the city gate, planning to kill him at dawn. But Samson left in the middle of the night. He didn't just sneak out. In an act of pure, contemptuous power, he grabbed the massive doors of the city gate, along with the 2 posts and the bar, and tore them from the wall. He hoisted the entire structure onto his shoulders and carried it away on a journey of what would have been nearly 40 miles to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. He didn't just escape. He stole the very symbol of their security as a trophy. This was Samson in his prime, invincible, reckless, and seemingly untouchable. He had defeated every enemy and broken every bond. But his greatest test was still to come, and it wouldn't be a lion or an army. It would be a woman named Delilah. After the spectacle at Gaza, the pattern of Samson's life was destined to repeat. The scripture says, sometime later, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The Bible doesn't say Delilah was a Philistine, but the context makes it almost certain. And unlike his previous encounters, his connection to Delilah is described as love. Whether it was true love or a deep infatuation, this relationship would be the final, devastating chapter of his life. The lords of the Philistines had been unable to beat Samson by force, but they were cunning, and they had spotted his one glaring weakness: women. Seeing his affection for Delilah, they saw their opening. They approached her not with threats, but with a staggering bribe. See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength, they proposed, on how we can overpower him. Each of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver. It was a fortune. Greed won out over any affection she might have had. Delilah agreed. She became a weapon, her seduction a carefully planned military strategy. The psychological battle began. With Samson resting, his head lightly in her lap, she began her gentle probing. "Tell me, Samson," she would have purred, "what is the secret of your great strength?" Samson, perhaps sensing the game, gave her the first of 3 lies. "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings," he said, "I'll become as weak as any other man." Delilah played her part. While he slept, Philistine soldiers hid in the room. She bound him with the bowstrings. Then she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke and snapped the bowstrings as if they were a single thread. The first attempt failed. Delilah put on a masterclass in manipulation. "You made a fool of me. You lied to me," she pouted. "Come on, tell me how you can be tied." He gave her a second lie. "If they tie me securely with new ropes that have never been used, I'll become weak." Once again, the trap was set. Delilah bound him with new ropes while the soldiers hid. She shouted the alarm, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." And just as before, he snapped the ropes off his arms as if they were threads. Her frustration grew, and her emotional manipulation intensified. "You have been making a fool of me and lying to me. Tell me how you can be tied." Samson, still playing his dangerous game, gave her a third, more elaborate lie that was dangerously close to the truth. If you weave the 7 braids of my head into the fabric on the loom, he told her, I'll become weak for the first time. He mentioned his hair, the symbol of his Nazirite vow. While he slept, Delilah wove his braids into her loom. Then, for the 3rd time, she screamed, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke and tore the entire loom out of the ground. The game was over. Samson had treated it all as a joke, but Delilah was not playing. She had to break not his bonds, but his will. The game was over. Delilah unleashed her full emotional assault. How can you say, I love you, when you won't confide in me? She accused him, her voice lightly thick with fake tears. This is the 3rd time you've made a fool of me. Day after day, she relentlessly pressed him, nagging and prodding until, as the Bible says, he was sick to death of it. The strongest man in the world was being worn down by the manipulative words of the woman he loved. His need to appease her was becoming greater than his will to protect the sacred secret of his existence. He was caught in a trap of his own making. His life had been a series of compromises. He'd touched a dead lion, partied at a wedding feast, and ignored the rules of his Nazirite vow again and again. Yet his strength had never failed him. Perhaps, in his arrogance, he'd started to believe the strength was his own, that the vow was just a symbol, and the hair was just hair. Exhausted by the emotional siege, Samson finally surrendered. The Bible says he told her everything. No razor has ever been used on my head, he confessed, because I have been a Nazirite, dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head was shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man. He had handed her the key. He had placed the essence of his divine power into the hands of a woman who had tried to betray him 3 times. Delilah knew this was the truth. Come back one more time. She messaged the Philistine lords. He has told me everything. They came, their hands filled with silver. That evening, she lulled him to sleep, his head resting on her lap, an image of profound and tragic intimacy. The man who could slay armies was vulnerable in the arms of his betrayer. She called in a man who silently came and, with a razor, cut off the 7 braids of Samson's hair. The sign of his covenant with God fell to the floor. As the last lock was shorn, Delilah's voice pierced the quiet. For the 4th and final time, she cried, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He awoke from his sleep, still confident. I'll go out as I did before and shake myself free, he thought. But then comes one of the most tragic sentences in all of Scripture. He did not know that the Lord had left him for the first time in his life. He called upon his strength, and there was no answer. He was just a man. The Philistines seized him. They held down the now powerless champion who had terrorized them for 2 decades, and then they enacted their terrible revenge. They didn't just kill him, they humiliated him. They gouged out his eyes. The man led astray by what he saw was now plunged into permanent darkness. Blinded, broken, and defeated. He was bound in bronze shackles and taken to Gaza, the very city whose gates he had once carried away. There, in the prison, the man born to be Israel's deliverer was forced to grind grain at the mill. a job for donkeys or servants. The hero had become a slave. In the darkness of the Gaza prison, Samson was an object of ridicule. The mighty warrior was now a blind slave. The Philistines celebrated, believing their god, Dagon, had triumphed over the God of Israel. They organized a great festival for Dagon. Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands. They proclaimed. The temple was packed. All the Philistine rulers were there, and the Bible says about 3,000 men and women were on the roof, all eager to see the fallen champion. When the crowd was in high spirits, they called for Samson to be brought out to entertain them. They led the blind man into the temple, making him stand between the two central pillars that supported the whole building. They mocked him and reveled in his humiliation. But in that prison, something had been happening that the Philistines had overlooked. Unnoticed, Samson's hair had begun to grow back. The physical sign of his vow was returning. But more importantly, in the darkness and humility of his captivity, something had shifted in his heart. His pride had been ground away with every turn of the millstone. He finally seemed to understand that the strength had never been his. It was a gift he had squandered. Standing in the chaotic temple, Samson made a quiet request to the servant boy who led him. Position me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so I can lean against them. The boy guided his hands to the two massive columns. With his hands on the pillars, Samson prayed. It wasn't an arrogant complaint like before. It was the desperate, broken prayer of a man with nothing left but his faith. Sovereign Lord, he whispered, remember me. Please God, strengthen me just one more time, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my two eyes. It was a prayer for vengeance, yes, but it was also a prayer for remembrance. In that final, desperate moment, Samson turned back to the only true source of his strength. And God answered. A final surge of divine power coursed through his body. He braced himself, his hands on the pillars, and shouted his last words, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might. The stone pillars groaned, the foundations shifted, and with a deafening roar, the massive temple of Dagon collapsed, crashing down on the rulers and the thousands of people packed inside and on the roof. In his death, Samson achieved his greatest victory. The Bible makes a point to tell us he killed many more when he died than while he lived. In one final, sacrificial act, he wiped out the entire Philistine leadership, delivering a devastating blow to their empire. After the dust settled, Samson's family came and recovered his body from the rubble. They carried him back home and buried him in the tomb of his father. His 20-year reign as a judge of Israel was over. The story of Samson is a true tragedy. It's about a man given extraordinary gifts who was brought down by his own ordinary weaknesses. His life is a brutal lesson about the consequences of pride and uncontrolled passion. He was a man who repeatedly broke the sacred vows that bound him to God, choosing fleeting pleasures over his divine purpose, and yet his story is also a profound testament to the power of God. Despite Samson's deep character flaws and his recklessness, God's ultimate plan was never stopped. God used this deeply imperfect man to fulfill his promise, to begin the deliverance of Israel. Samson's story shows that God can and does work through broken people to accomplish his will. His final act wasn't just revenge. In his last moments, in weakness and humility, Samson finally turned back to God in faith, and God answered. That final prayer was his ultimate act of judgment against Israel's oppressors. A redemptive moment where his death accomplished more than his life ever could. His story warns us that our greatest strengths can destroy us if we detach them from their source. But it also offers hope that even in our deepest failures, God's mercy is powerful enough to grant one last moment of strength. One final act of redemption. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button to help us share more stories like this. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What lessons do you take from the life of Samson? Be sure to check out our other videos on the epic figures of history and scripture. Thank you for watching.
Stardust Tales Angdif's audiobooks full length for sleep. Subscribe and turn on notifications.
Imagine a world painted only in the colors of life. A world without the sigh of autumn or the cold bite of winter. It was a world of eternal spring, where the sun always shone with a gentle, honeyed warmth, and the grass was forever soft and green. This was the world back then, under the watchful eye of Demeter, the great Earth Mother, the goddess of the harvest and all growing things. Demeter was the very heart of this world's abundance. Her joy was the warmth that coaxed seeds from the soil. Her laughter was the gentle rain that nourished the roots. The whole world was her garden, and her contentment created an endless parade of blooming flowers and ripening fruit. And right in the center of that garden was her most precious flower of all. Her daughter, her name was Cori, which means the maiden, though we know her better today as Persephone. She was the daughter of Demeter and the mighty Zeus, and she was the living, breathing embodiment of her mother's joy. If Demeter was the deep, nurturing earth, Persephone was the first bloom of spring. Her light feet seemed to encourage crocuses and hyacinths to rise up and meet her. Her laughter, carried on the breeze, was the very scent of jasmine and honeysuckle. She was youth, life, and pure, sun-drenched happiness. The two were inseparable. Demeter's whole existence was devoted to her daughter's happiness, and Persephone's world was the warm, safe, beautiful one her mother had made just for her. She spent her timeless days in the meadows of Nysa, a place so impossibly beautiful it felt more like a dream than reality. There, she would wander with her friends, the graceful Oceanids nymphs of the sea, their laughter echoing through fields of wildflower and iris. They'd weave crowns from violets and poppies, their fingers stained with the juice of wild berries. They'd chase butterflies that shimmered like scattered jewels in the air. Persephone, the gentlest of them all, was loved by every living thing. Fawns would eat from her hand, and birds would sing their sweetest songs just for her. This was her life, a long, unbroken song of peace, cradled in her mother's unwavering love, in a world that had never known a single shadow of sorrow. It was perfect, and as the old stories teach us, perfection is a fragile thing. It's a stillness that can't last, because where there is that much light, a shadow is bound to fall. The golden age of an eternal spring, so let's just stay here for a moment. In this world before everything changed, let's breathe in the air that Persephone knew, thick with the perfume of a million blossoms. In this time before time, Demeter's power was absolute. She wasn't just the goddess of the harvest. She was the harvest. Her very being was woven into the living world. The sap in the trees was her blood. The golden waves of grain were the flowing of her hair. The steady, deep warmth of the soil was her own heartbeat. Humanity, still in its infancy, knew her as the giver of all life. They lived in a state of peaceful gratitude, because there was no hardship, no desperate prayers for rain, no fear of a killing frost, no gnawing hunger from a failed crop. There was only the endless bounty that flowed from Demeter's boundless love for her child. Every stalk of wheat, every apple that reddened on the branch, was a testament to the joy she felt watching Persephone play in the sunlit fields. The world wasn't fed by labor, but by a goddess's happiness. Persephone, in her innocence, was the vessel for this joy. She was called Kori, the maiden, and that name captured the very essence of who she was. She was potential, the promise of a flower before it blooms, the quiet hope inside a seed. Her days were a study in simple perfection. She'd explore the hidden corners of her mother's creation, knowing the secret places where the wildest orchids grew and the streams where the water ran so clear you could count every polished stone on the riverbed. Her companions, the oceanids, were creatures of similar light. They didn't talk of the world's sorrows because they didn't know any. Their conversations were about the beauty of a flower, the sweetness of a honeycomb, the patterns of the clouds in the endless blue sky. There was no jealousy, no ambition, no fear. Imagine the feel of that world. The sun on your skin, a warmth that never scorches, only soothes. The feeling of cool, soft moss under your feet. The sound of 1,000 bees humming their drowsy song in the clover, the very definition of peace. The taste of a wild strawberry bursting with a sweetness no cultivated fruit could ever match. This was Persephone's reality. Demeter often watched her from afar, her heart swelling with a love so powerful it would cause a new field of flowers to burst into bloom on a nearby hillside. To see her daughter so full of life and light was all she needed. She had crafted a perfect world to be a safe and beautiful playground for her child. She'd banished all thoughts of darkness, of pain, of endings. In her mind, this golden age would stretch on forever. But Demeter, in her focused devotion, had forgotten a fundamental truth. She'd forgotten that the world wasn't hers alone. She'd forgotten about her brothers. While Zeus ruled the bright sky and Poseidon the churning seas, another brother, Hades, had been given domain over everything that lay beneath the earth, the dark, silent, and vast kingdom of the Underworld. And from his shadowy throne, the lonely king had been watching the world of light. More than the light, he had been watching the girl who was its very heart. He had been watching Persephone. The shadow in the meadow the day it happened began like any other. The light was the same soft gold. The air was filled with the same sweet scents. Persephone and the Oceanids had wandered to a meadow they hadn't visited before. The Vale of Nysa. It was a place of spectacular beauty, even for a world made of beauty. But Persephone felt a pull toward the center of the meadow. And there, standing all by itself, was a flower unlike any she had ever seen. It was a narcissus, but it was so impossibly perfect, it seemed to hum with a strange energy. It was a lure planted there by Gaia, the earth herself, at the request of Hades and with the silent permission of Zeus. While her friends were distracted at the edge of the field, Persephone was captivated. She felt an overwhelming urge to have this one perfect bloom for herself. She knelt, her fingers reaching for the stem. The scent that rose from it was dizzying. It smelled of damp earth, of deep, hidden things, of secrets buried far from the sun. As her fingers closed around the stem, a low tremor ran through the ground. It wasn't violent, but it was deep, a vibration that seemed to come from the very bones of the world. She pulled at the flower. Its roots held fast. She pulled again with all her strength, and as she plucked the flower from the soil, the earth itself gave a great, groaning roar. The ground before her tore open a perfect, dark fissure splitting the green meadow like a wound. From that chasm, a profound and absolute blackness rose, a void that seemed to drink the golden light. Out of this void thundered a chariot of black iron and obsidian, drawn by 4 immense, powerful horses, their coats the color of a starless midnight, and their eyes glowing like coals. And holding the reins was a figure of terrible, silent majesty. It was Hades, king of the underworld. He wasn't a monster. He was a god, stern and powerful, his face etched with the loneliness of ages. His eyes, full of a deep and ancient sorrow, were fixed only on her. He had seen the light and life in her, the one thing his vast, wealthy, silent kingdom lacked. And he had come to claim it. Persephone was frozen, not just by fear, but by a stunning awe. He was the opposite of her world in every way: dark, where it was light; silent, where it was singing; ancient, where it was young. Before she could scream, before her friends could even register what was happening, he leaned down from the chariot, his grip strong and sure, and swept her up the Oceanids, cried out, their voices lost in the roaring from the earth. Persephone gave a single, piercing shriek that carried across the meadow a cry for her mother. But it was too late. Hades pulled her into the chariot and turned the great black horses back toward the abyss. They plunged downward into the waiting darkness, and as they descended, the earth, with a sound like a final, mournful sigh, sealed itself shut above them. The fissure vanished. The perfect green meadow was restored. The only evidence that anything had happened at all was a scattering of dropped wildflowers, and the faint, haunting echo of a daughter's last cry, a sound that only a mother's heart could truly hear. The descent had begun. A mother's grief, a world's wintered, that final desperate cry didn't just vanish. It traveled, it wove through the trees and over the hills, a needle of pure terror, and it found its way directly into the heart of Demeter. She felt it like a physical blow, a pain so sharp and immediate that she dropped the bundle of vines in her hand. Her daughter's name tore from her lips, first a whisper, then a roar. Persephone. She abandoned her duties without a second thought. The grapes on the vine, moments from perfection, shriveled and soured. Her divine warmth, which nurtured the world, dimmed and drew inward, consumed by panic. She raced to the Vale of Nysa and found a scene of chilling stillness. The nymphs were huddled together, weeping, pointing to the center of the meadow and babbling about the ground opening and a dark king. But of Persephone there was no sign, only the crushed flowers she had dropped. And so Demeter's search began. It wasn't a measured search. It was a frantic, desperate scouring of the earth. For 9 days and 9 nights, she didn't rest, she didn't eat. She took 2 great pine torches and plunged into the darkest forests and scaled the highest mountains. Her voice raw from calling her daughter's name into the emptiness dot as she wandered. Her grief began to bleed into the world. Her despair was a tangible force. Where her tears fell, the soil grew barren and cracked. Where her shadow passed, the vibrant green leaves curled, turned a sickly yellow, and fell to the ground. The rivers grew sluggish and grey. The air, once warm and sweet, grew thin and sharp with a new, unfamiliar cold. The world was mirroring her broken, cold, and barren heart. She asked everyone she met, gods, mortals, nymphs, if they had seen her daughter, but none would speak the truth. Some truly didn't know. Others, aware that Zeus had allowed this, feared his wrath and feigned ignorance. On the 10th day, her torches burned down. She encountered Hecate, the mysterious goddess of magic. Hecate had heard the scream, but hadn't seen the abduction. Looking at Demeter's ravaged form with pity, she said, "I heard her cry, but there is only one who could have seen everything. We must go to Helios, the sun." Together, they went to the palace of Helios, the all-seeing sun god. He couldn't meet Demeter's desperate gaze. He told her of Hades emerging from the earth. And then he delivered the final, crushing blow. He told her that Zeus, her brother, the father of her child, had sanctioned it. He had given their daughter away. The grief in Demeter's heart curdled into a cold, diamond-hard rage, betrayed not just by Hades, but by the king of the gods himself. In that moment, she made a vow. If her world was to be broken, then all worlds would be broken with it. She would not return to Olympus. She would not perform her sacred duties. She took her divine gift, the power of life and growth, and she locked it away deep inside her frozen heart. The effect was catastrophic. The blight became absolute. Across the world, all growth ceased. Seeds wouldn't sprout. Wheat withered in the fields. Trees dropped their unripe, rotten fruit. The earth grew cold and hard as iron. A great and terrible famine spread. People starved. The cries of hungry children replaced the sound of birdsong. The altars of the gods grew bare. This was the first winter. It wasn't a season. It was a weapon. It was a mother's grief made real. A cosmic strike against the gods who had wronged her. It was Demeter holding the entire world hostage, declaring that if her daughter could not walk in the sun, then nothing on earth would ever grow in the sun again. The Queen of Shades and the plea of mortals, while the world above withered, Persephone was transforming. The underworld was nothing like the meadows she knew. It was a realm of profound silence, of vast, echoing caverns, and a strange, silvery twilight beauty. Rivers of shadow flowed through fields of ghostly, pale asphodel flowers. The air was cool and still. Hades led her to his palace of black marble, inlaid with veins of raw silver and gold. It was opulent, but it was a cold, lonely opulence. He offered her everything: mountains of diamonds, rivers of molten gold, but at first she wanted none of it. She refused the lavish meals he offered, knowing instinctively that to eat the food of this place was to be bound to it forever. She would sit for hours in the ghostly gardens, her heart aching with a homesickness so profound it was a physical pain. But she was the daughter of two powerful gods, and a quiet strength began to bloom within her, a flower that could grow even in the dark. She started to see that Hades wasn't the monster she had imagined. He was a king, burdened by his solemn duty, and he was profoundly lonely. In his own stern way, he loved her. He treated her not as a prisoner, but as a queen. Slowly, a change occurred. Persephone started to walk through the kingdom on her own. The silent, drifting shades of the dead, who feared their dark king, seemed drawn to her quiet light. She began to find her purpose. If Hades was the stern judge, she could be the compassionate queen. She brought a measure of grace to the land of the dead, becoming a comfort for the lost and frightened souls. She was no longer just Cori, the maiden. She was becoming Persephone, queen of the underworld, the figure of both light and shadow. Meanwhile, on Earth, the endless winter had broken civilization. Mortals were dying by the thousands, and with their deaths, the worship of the gods ceased. The smoke of sacrifice no longer rose to Olympus. Zeus, who had at first ignored Demeter's rage, could no longer do so. The entire cosmic order was on the verge of collapse. He sent messenger after messenger to Demeter. First came Iris, the rainbow messenger, with promises of great gifts. Demeter cast her out. One by one, the greatest of the gods came to plead with her. To each of them, she gave the same answer. She would not let a single blade of grass grow until she saw her daughter with her own eyes. Finally, realizing that nothing would move the grieving mother, Zeus knew he had only one choice left. The hostage had to be returned. He summoned his swiftest messenger, the clever Hermes, and gave him his command. Go down to the realm of Hades. Command him, in my name, to release Persephone and send her back to the light, so her mother may see her and end this terrible winter before all life is extinguished. Hermes fastened his winged sandals and plunged from the heights of Olympus, a streak of gold descending toward the dark heart of the world, carrying the last hope of both mortals and gods. The fateful choice, the crimson seeds, Hermes moved through the underworld with a speed and confidence few could manage. He found Persephone, not in despair, but seated on a throne of ebony beside Hades, a quiet dignity about her. He delivered Zeus's command, speaking of the dying world above and Demeter's unyielding grief. Hades listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He knew he couldn't defy a direct order from Zeus. He looked at Persephone, the ancient loneliness in his eyes deepening. He had brought light into his kingdom, and now he was being told to let it go. With a heavy heart, he turned to his queen. You may go, Persephone, he said, his voice low. Return to your mother. End her sorrow. A wave of joyous relief washed over Persephone. Her mother, the sun, the life she thought she had lost forever was being given back. She rose, ready to leave at once. But Hades held up a hand. Before you go, he said softly, you must be hungry. You've refused all food here. Let me offer you one small thing as a token of our time together. He motioned to an attendant who brought forward a single pomegranate on a silver platter. It was beautiful, its skin a deep, leathery crimson. In the dim light, it seemed to glow with a dark inner fire. Hades took a small knife and cut it open, revealing a treasure chest of jewels. Hundreds of tiny seeds, each encased in a glistening, blood-red pulp, shone like rubies. Just a few seeds, Hades urged gently, to remember the sweetness that can be found even in the darkest of places. Persephone hesitated. She knew the ancient law. To taste the food of the underworld, was to bind yourself to it. But she was so hungry, and the sight of the vibrant, juicy seeds awakened a deep longing for the taste of life. Maybe she was moved by a pang of pity for the lonely king she was leaving. Or maybe, in some small part of her heart, a connection to this strange, silent kingdom had already taken root. Looking the dark king in the eye, she made her choice. She reached out and took a small cluster of seeds. One by one, she placed them in her mouth. Some say it was 3. Some say 4. The version we're telling tonight says she ate 6 seeds. 6. Hermes, watching, knew at once what this meant. The bargain was sealed, not by the words of gods, but by the simple act of eating 6 crimson seeds. Hades's face remained impassive, but a flicker of triumph passed through his shadowy eyes. He hadn't defied Zeus. He had simply ensured that his queen would have to return. Persephone, her heart now light with the thought of her reunion, didn't yet understand the full weight of her choice. She didn't realize that with those 6 small seeds, she had bound herself and the world above to both realms forever. The compromise and the turning of the wheel, the ascent, was a blur of shadow and wind. And then light, blinding, brilliant, glorious light. Persephone emerged near the temple at Eleusis, and the moment her foot touched the dead soil, a tremor of life ran through it. Demeter was there. She saw her daughter standing in the sunlight, and a cry of pure joy ripped from her soul. They ran to each other and embraced, and where their happy tears fell on the frozen ground, the frost melted. The first green shoots of grass pushed their way through the hard earth. A dormant tree nearby burst into a riot of blossoms. Demeter's joy was flowing back into the world. But as she held her daughter, a cold dread crept back into her heart. She pulled back and asked the fateful question. "Did you eat anything, my child, in that dark place?" Persephone's joyful expression faltered. She looked down. He gave me a pomegranate, and I ate. Just 6 small seeds. Demeter let out a wail of despair. The blossoms on the nearby tree instantly withered. The new green grass faded. She knew the ancient law. Her daughter was bound to the underworld. But Zeus, seeing the world teetering on the brink, intervened one last time. A compromise was struck. Because she had eaten 6 seeds, Persephone would not be completely free, but she would not be completely bound either. The year would be divided. For 6 months, one for each seed she had eaten, she must return to the underworld and rule as its queen beside her husband. Hades. But for the other 6 months, she would be free to return to the world above, to live in the light with her mother. It wasn't the perfect reunion Demeter had fought for, but it wasn't a total loss. With a heavy heart, she accepted Dot. And so, the great wheel of the seasons began its first turn. For 6 months, as Persephone lives with Demeter, the goddess's heart is filled with joy. That joy radiates out. The sun shines warmly, the lands grow fertile, and the crops grow tall. These are the months of spring and summer. But then, as the time comes for her daughter to descend once more, Demeter's grief returns. As Persephone goes back to the land of shadows, her mother's sorrow chills the air. The leaves turn gold, and crimson, the color of that fateful pomegranate hand, fall from the trees. The earth grows dormant and rests. These are the months of autumn and winter, and so it is to this very day. The story of winter isn't a story of death, but of sleep. It's the story of a mother's longing and a daughter's duty. It's the story of how one young goddess learned to carry both sunlight and shadow in her heart, and in doing so brought balance to the world. When you feel the first crisp chill in the autumn air, that's the echo of Demeter's first sigh of sadness. When you see the last leaf fall, it's a tear for her departing child. And when the world lies still and white under a blanket of snow, it is the shape of her quiet, sleeping grief. But this story also teaches us that the stillness is never the end. It reminds us that even in the deepest darkness, the seeds of life are waiting, kept warm and safe in the quiet earth, just as Persephone is kept safe in her shadowed kingdom. It is a promise that after the dark, light and warmth will always return, because as surely as Persephone must descend, she must also always ascend. And with her return, she brings the spring. If you'd like to drift away with more relaxing stories from ancient worlds, be sure to subscribe for more mythology bedtime stories. Until next time, sleep well.
Stardust Tales and Gifts audiobooks full length for sleep. Subscribe and turn on notifications.
The ashes of war and the forgetful flower, the great Trojan War, was over. 10 years of dust and struggle had finally settled, leaving behind only the ghosts of heroes and the smoldering ruins of a once proud city. Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca, stood on the shore, the salty air a welcome change from the scent of battle. He was a man of many turns, known for his wit, but now his only thought was of home. He longed for the sight of his island, for the face of his loyal wife, Penelope, and for his son, Telemachus, who was just a boy when he left. He gathered his remaining men, survivors of a long, hard war, and they boarded their 12 ships. The sails billowed, and they finally turned their backs on Troy. A feeling of profound relief settled over the crew. The journey home had begun, but the sea, ruled by the unpredictable whims of gods, is never a simple path. Their first stop was the land of the Cicones. Driven by the lingering habits of war, Odysseus's men raided the city, celebrating their victory with too much wine. Odysseus urged them to leave quickly, a sense of foreboding stirring in him, but his men, drunk on freedom, didn't listen. As dawn broke, the surviving Cicones returned with reinforcements. A fierce battle erupted on the beach, and Odysseus lost good men before they were finally forced back to their ships, their hearts heavy with a fresh, needless grief. It was a bitter first lesson. The war was over, but the world was still a dangerous place. Sailing away, a terrible storm, sent by angry gods, descended upon them. For 9 days, they were driven across the sea, lost and battered. On the 10th day, the winds died, and they found themselves washed ashore on a strange, tranquil island. This was the land of the Lotus Eaters. The island was beautiful, almost unnaturally so. The air was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of flowers. The natives were gentle and peaceful, offering the sailors their food, the honey-sweet fruit of the lotus plant. Odysseus, ever cautious, sent only a few men to investigate. When hours passed and they didn't return, he went ashore himself. He found his scouts sitting among the Lotus Eaters, their faces serene, their eyes holding a distant, dreamy gaze. They were eating the lotus, and its magic had washed away their memories. They'd forgotten Troy, forgotten the war, and forgotten their desperate longing for home. When Odysseus told them it was time to leave, they just shook their heads, wishing only to stay and eat the sweet fruit forever. A cold dread filled Odysseus. This peaceful place was a trap more dangerous than any sword. To lose one's purpose was a fate worse than death. He and his loyal men had to physically drag the weeping scouts back to the ship, tying them beneath the rowing benches. He ordered the others to board at once, and they rowed away with all their might, leaving the island of forgetfulness behind them. The longing for home was a compass. Odysseus knew, and without it, they were truly lost. The cave of the Cyclops, after escaping the Lotus. Odysseus and his fleet sailed on, their minds now sharply focused. The sea was calm for a time, and soon they came upon a rugged, wild island. From their ships, they could see green pastures and hear the bleating of sheep. It seemed a promising place for fresh water and food. Leaving the main fleet behind, Odysseus took his own ship and his 12 best men to explore. They walked inland, drawn by curiosity towards a large cave set into a hillside. The entrance was enormous. This was clearly the home of something of great size. Odysseus felt a familiar unease, but he brought with him a goatskin full of strong, sweet wine, just in case they reached the cave and found it empty. Inside were pens with lambs and kids, and shelves stacked high with giant cheeses. His men urged him to take some supplies and leave quickly. But Odysseus, his curiosity getting the better of him, refused. He wanted to see who lived here, to see what kind of hospitality he would offer. It was a decision he would come to regret. As evening fell, a shadow fell over the cave. A monstrous figure appeared, a giant of a man with a single, massive eye in the center of his forehead. A Cyclops. He drove a flock of ewes into the cave before rolling a colossal boulder over the entrance. Sealing it shut, the Cyclops lit a fire, and its flickering light revealed the trapped Greeks. Strangers, the giant boomed, his voice like rocks grinding together. Who are you? Traders or pirates? Odysseus, though terrified, stepped forward. We are Achaeans, blown off course from Troy. We are your guests, and we ask for your hospitality in the name of Zeus. The Cyclops let out a cruel laugh. You are a fool. We Cyclopes don't care for Zeus. We are stronger than the gods. Without another word, the monster lunged, grabbing 2 of Odysseus's men. To their horror, he smashed them against the cave floor and devoured them. The remaining men could only watch in paralyzed terror. When he had finished, the Cyclops, whose name was Polyphemus, stretched out and fell into a deep sleep. In the darkness, Odysseus drew his sword, but stopped himself. If he killed the Cyclops, they would be trapped forever. They could never move the massive stone. The next morning, the Cyclops awoke, ate 2 more men for breakfast, and left for the pastures, sealing the cave behind him. Odysseus was left with his dwindling, weeping crew, but despair was a luxury he couldn't afford. His mind began to work. He noticed a huge club of green olive wood the Cyclops had left behind. While the giant was away, Odysseus and his men cut a 6-foot length from the club and sharpened one end to a fine point, hardening it in the fire. They hid the stake. When Polyphemus returned that evening and had eaten 2 more men, Odysseus put his plan into motion. He approached the giant, holding out the wineskin. "Great Polyphemus," he said, "drink this wine. A gift so you might take pity on us." The Cyclops, who had never tasted wine, drank it greedily. "Give me more," he bellowed, "and tell me your name so I may give you a gift." Odysseus refilled the bowl 3 times. As the strong wine began to cloud the giant's mind, Odysseus replied, "You ask for my name. My name is Nobody. A fine name." The Cyclops roared with laughter. "Then here is my gift to you, Nobody. I will eat you last." With that, he slumped to the floor in a drunken sleep. Now was the time. Odysseus and his men heated the stake's point until it glowed red. With a coordinated effort, they lifted the massive spear and drove it deep into the Cyclops' single eye. Polyphemus let out a horrific, earth-shaking scream, tearing the stake from his eye and flailing blindly. He stumbled to the entrance, rolled away the stone, and bellowed for help from the other Cyclopes. His brothers came to the outside of the cave and called out, "What is wrong, Polyphemus? Who was hurting you?" And the blinded giant roared back, "Nobody is killing me. Nobody is killing me by treachery." Hearing this, the other Cyclopes assumed he was mad or cursed. "If nobody is hurting you," they replied, "then it must be an illness. Pray to your father, Poseidon." And they went away. The trick had worked, but they still had to escape. The blinded Polyphemus now sat in the entrance, his arms outstretched, feeling for anything that tried to pass. Another idea sparked. Odysseus tied his men to the undersides of the giant rams in the cave, lashing 3 together at a time with a man on the middle one. For himself, he chose the largest ram of all and clung to the thick wool of its belly. When morning came, the rams moved towards the entrance. Polyphemus ran his hands over the back of each animal, but he didn't feel the men hidden beneath. As the great ram carrying Odysseus passed, the Cyclops paused, stroking it. "My dear ram," he mumbled, "are you grieving for your master's eye, blinded by that wretched nobody?" Then he let the ram pass. Once clear of the cave, they untied themselves and hurried the flock down to their ship. They quickly set sail. But as they pulled away, Odysseus's pride got the better of him. He shouted a taunt back at the blinded giant. "Cyclops, if anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, king of Ithaca. It was a terrible mistake." Polyphemus, hearing the name, broke off a hilltop and hurled it at the ship. The massive rock landed just in front of their bow, creating a huge wave that nearly washed them back to shore. Then Polyphemus raised his hands to the sky and prayed to his father. "Poseidon, the god of the sea, hear me, Poseidon. Grant that Odysseus never reaches his home. But if it is his fate, let him come back late in misery, having lost all his companions in a stranger's ship, and find trouble in his house." And Poseidon, the earth shaker, heard his son's prayer. Odysseus had escaped the cave, but he had just earned the undying wrath of a powerful god. His journey home had become infinitely more difficult. The gift of winds and the cannibal giants having escaped the Cyclops, but now cursed by Poseidon, Odysseus and his crew sailed on. After some time, they arrived at a floating island encased in a wall of unbreakable bronze. This was Aeolia, home of Aeolus, the master of the winds. Aeolus welcomed them warmly. For a whole month, he hosted them, fascinated by Odysseus's tales of Troy. Impressed, Aeolus decided to help. On their departure, he gave Odysseus a remarkable gift, a bag made of oxide, containing all the stormy winds. He left only the gentle west wind free to blow their ships safely home. He warned Odysseus not to open the bag under any circumstances. With grateful hearts, they set sail. For 9 days, the west wind blew them smoothly across the sea. On the 10th day, they saw the shores of Ithaca. They were so close they could see smoke rising from their own homes. Exhausted but overjoyed, Odysseus finally allowed himself to fall asleep. But while he slept, his crew's greed got the better of them. They whispered amongst themselves, imagining the bag was filled with gold from Io. Feeling it was unfair for Odysseus to have such a prize, they untied the silver string. Instantly, all the trapped winds burst forth in a furious gale. The tempest spun the ships around and drove them violently back the way they had come. Odysseus awoke to chaos, the sky black, the sea churning, and the shores of Ithaca shrinking in the distance. His crew's foolishness had undone everything. They were blown all the way back to Io. Ashamed, Odysseus went to Aeolus to beg for help once more. But this time, the master of the winds was cold. "Begone," he declared. "It is clear you are hated by the gods. I will not help a man so obviously cursed." Dejected, they had to row. For 6 days and nights, they rowed until they came to a land with a tall cliff surrounding a harbor. All the ships, except Odysseus's own, sailed into this seemingly safe harbor. But Odysseus, feeling a prickle of caution, kept his ship outside the cliffs. He sent 3 men inland to investigate. They soon met a young woman of gigantic stature, the daughter of the king, and she pointed them towards her father's house. When they arrived, the queen, a woman as tall as a mountain, snatched up one of the men to eat him. The other 2 fled in terror. The king raised an alarm, and from all over the land came the Lastrygonians, a race of giant cannibals. They swarmed to the cliffs overlooking the harbor and began hurling massive boulders down at the trapped ships. The sound was terrible, the splintering of wood, the crashing of rocks, and the cries of his men. The giants speared the sailors like fish. Odysseus, watching in horror from his ship, knew he could do nothing. He cut the rope mooring his ship and screamed at his crew to row for their lives. They rowed with the frantic energy of sheer terror. Of the 12 ships that had set sail from Troy, only 1 remained. All the others, and all the men aboard them, were lost. The sea ahead was vast and lonely. The island of the Sorceress, drift and grieving, Odysseus and the last of his men sailed on. The silence on their lone ship was heavy. Finally, they reached the shore of a new island, Yea. For 2 days, they lay on the sand, consumed by sorrow and fatigue. On the 3rd day, Odysseus took his spear and climbed a high point. The island appeared uninhabited, except for a thin plume of smoke rising from a dense forest. He returned to his men. They needed to investigate, but the memory of the Cyclops and the Lastrygonians made them all deeply afraid. He divided his men. He would stay with one group by the ship, while the other, led by his kinsman Eurylochus, would go inland. With great reluctance, Eurylochus and his 22 men set off in a clearing. They found a house of polished stone. Strange, though, were the animals around it. Lions and wolves prowled the woods, but instead of attacking, they approached the men, tamely, wagging their tails like pet dogs. The men were unsettled. As they stood at the gate, they heard a beautiful voice singing from within. It was a captivating, otherworldly sound. They called out, and a woman appeared. She was dazzlingly beautiful. This was Circe, the sorceress. With a warm smile, she invited the men inside. All of them, charmed by her beauty, eagerly followed her in all, except the cautious Eurydice. He sensed something was wrong and stayed behind to watch. Inside, Circe served the men a mixture of cheese, honey, and wine. Hungry and thirsty, they consumed it all, but the food was drugged. As soon as they had finished, she stood up, tapped each man with her wand, and instantly they were transformed into pigs. Though they had the bodies of swine, their minds remained human, and they wept in their pens as Circe threw them acorns to eat. Eurylochus saw it all. He ran back to the ship in a panic, stammering out the terrible story. He begged Odysseus to flee, to abandon the men, but Odysseus would not leave his men behind. He set off alone for Circe's house, determined to save his crew or die trying. As he walked through the enchanted woods, a young man appeared before him. It was the god Hermes. "Unhappy man," Hermes said gently, "you cannot defeat Circe's magic on your own, but I will help you." He pulled a plant from the earth. "Take this herb. It is called moly. It will protect you from her magic. When she offers you her potion, drink it. When she tries to strike you with her wand, you must draw your sword and rush at her. She will be afraid. Make her swear a great oath not to harm you." Odysseus took the moly gratefully and continued to Circe's house. She greeted him, gave him the same potion, and he drank it. After he drank, she smiled slyly and tapped him with her wand. "Go now to the sty," she said, but nothing happened. As Hermes had instructed, Odysseus drew his sword and lunged at her. Circe shrieked and fell to his knees. "You must be Odysseus," she gasped. "Put away your sword. Let us make a pact." Remembering Hermes' warning, Odysseus made her swear a solemn oath not to harm him or his men. True to her word, Circe led him to the pigsty. She anointed each pig, and they transformed back into men, younger and more handsome than before. They wept with joy. Circe then invited them all to stay and rest. For a full year, they lived in her enchanted halls, feasting and recovering. Odysseus himself became Circe's lover, and for a time found a strange peace. But as the seasons turned, his men grew restless. "Captain," they said, "it is time to remember Ithaca." The words struck Odysseus's heart. He had allowed himself to be lulled into contentment, but his longing for home was not gone. That night, he told Circe he had to leave. The sorceress was sad but did not try to stop him. She told him, however, that his journey home could not be direct. First, he had to travel to the edge of the world, to the land of the dead, to consult the spirit of the blind prophet Tiresias. Only Tiresias could tell him how to appease Poseidon and what trials still lay ahead. The news filled Odysseus with dread. To go to the land of Hades was a journey from which few had ever returned. The kingdom of the dead Circe's command filled Odysseus and his men with a chilling fear. At dawn, she provided a black awe and a ram for the necessary sacrifice and gave him careful instructions for the journey to the dark shores at the very edge of the world. With a heavy heart, Odysseus and his crew set sail. A strange wind, sent by Circe, carried them swiftly over the water. As the sun set, they arrived at the land of the Cimmerians, a place perpetually shrouded in mist and fog, where the sun never shines. Odysseus disembarked alone. He dug a pit with his sword and poured offerings to the dead milk and honey, sweet wine and water. He prayed to the powerless ghosts. Then he sacrificed the sheep, letting their dark blood flow into the pit. At once, the spirits of the dead began to rise, swarming around the pit. Drawn by the scent of blood, fear seized Odysseus, but he remembered Circe's instructions. He drew his sword and stood guard over the pit, preventing any spirit from touching the blood until he had spoken with Tiresias. The first spirit he recognized was LP, one of his own crewmen who had fallen from Circe's roof the night before they left. His ghost begged Odysseus to return and give his body a proper funeral so his spirit could find rest. Odysseus, his heart aching, promised he would dot next. He saw the shade of his own mother, Anticlea, whom he had left alive in Ithaca. The sight of her broke his heart, and he wept. But even her he had to hold back from the blood. Finally, the spirit of Tiresias appeared. He drank from the dark blood, and his voice filled the gloom with prophecy. He confirmed Poseidon was still enraged. "But you may still reach home," Tiresias said, "if you can control your desires on the island of Threnichar. There you will find the sacred cattle of Helios, the sun god. Do not harm them. If you leave them untouched, you will all return to Ithaca. But if your men harm them, I foretell destruction for your ship and your crew. You alone will escape, returning late and in a stranger's ship, to find your house filled with arrogant men." The prophet also told him that even after he returned home, his journey wouldn't be over. He would have to take an oar and travel inland to a place where people have never seen the sea, and there make a final sacrifice to Poseidon to appease the god's anger. After Tiresias retreated, Odysseus allowed his mother's spirit to approach. She told him Penelope was still waiting faithfully, and their son Telemachus was growing into a man. She told him that she herself had died of a broken heart from her long, endless grief for him. Odysseus tried 3 times to embrace her, but each time his arms passed right through her, like a shadow or a dream. He then spoke with a procession of other famous spirits. He saw his fallen comrades from Troy. The great Agamemnon told him of his own tragic homecoming, murdered by his wife, and warned Odysseus to be cautious, to arrive in secret. He also saw Achilles, who said with great sorrow, "I would rather be a slave on earth to the poorest farmer than be a king over all these breathless dead." His mission complete, Odysseus returned to his ship, his mind filled with chilling prophecies. They had spoken with the dead, and now they had to face the living world again. The shores of Ithaca seemed further away than ever. The song of the Sirens and the clashing rocks returning from the kingdom of the dead. Odysseus and his men sailed back to Aea to fulfill their promise to Elpinor, giving him a proper funeral. That evening, Circe took Odysseus aside and warned him of the dangers to come. First, she said, "You will come to the island of the Sirens. They lure sailors to their doom with their beautiful, irresistible song. The shore is littered with the bones of men who have listened." She gave him instructions. "Plug the ears of your crewmen with soft beeswax. But if you wish to hear their song, have your men tie you to the mast. You must order them that no matter how much you beg, they must only bind you tighter. After the Sirens, she continued, you face a choice. One route has the clashing rocks, which no ship has ever survived. The other takes you through a narrow strait. On one side is Scylla. She has 6 long necks, and on each neck is a ghastly head. She hides in a cave and snatches 6 sailors from any passing ship. It is impossible to fight her. On the other side of the strait, Circe warned, is Charybdis. 3 times a day, she swallows the sea into a terrifying whirlpool, and 3 times a day, she spews it back out. If you were there when she sucks the water down, nothing can save you. Her advice was grim. It is far better to lose 6 men to Scylla than to lose your entire ship to Charybdis. Row close to Scylla's cliff and pass with all speed. The next morning, they set sail. As they approached the Sirens' island, Odysseus followed Circe's advice. He plugged his crew's ears with beeswax, and they, in turn, tied him securely to the mast. Soon, the beautiful, enchanting song of the Sirens drifted across the water, promising an end to all sorrow. Come here, Odysseus, they sang. We know all the suffering you endured at Troy, and we know everything that happens on this earth. The song was an irresistible temptation. He forgot all of Circe's warnings. He struggled against his bonds, shouting and commanding his men to untie him. But they, unable to hear the song, only remembered his orders. 2 men stood up and added more ropes, binding him even tighter. They rowed on until the song faded. Only then did they remove the wax and untie their shaken captain. No sooner had they recovered than they heard a new, terrifying sound ahead, the thunderous roar of crashing waves. Panic seized the crew. They dropped their oars. Odysseus moved among them, his voice calm. Friends, he said, we have faced worse than this. Remember the Cyclops. My cunning saved us then, and it will save us now. Steersman, hug the cliffside. Oarsman, row with all your strength. He didn't tell them about Scylla, knowing they would panic. He put on his armor and scanned the cliff face, but saw nothing. As they rode into the narrowest part of the strait, Charybdis began her terrible inhalation. As all eyes were fixed in terror on the whirlpool, Scylla struck. 6 long necks shot down, and 6 monstrous heads snatched 6 of his best men from the deck. Odysseus heard their screams. He turned to see them being lifted high, crying out his name one last time before being dragged into the monster's cave. It was, Odysseus would later say, the most pitiful sight of his entire journey. There was nothing he could do. He urged his men to row for their lives until they were clear of the strait. They had survived, but at the cost of 6 more friends. The forbidden cattle of the sun-shaken and grieving, Odysseus and his crew continued on. Ahead, they saw the island of Thrinacia, land of the sun god, Helios. The warnings of both Tiresias and Circe echoed in his mind. They must not harm the sacred cattle that grazed there. He tried to persuade his men to sail past. Friends, he pleaded, this is a forbidden place. It will be our doom if we linger here. But his crew, led by Eurydice, was on the verge of mutiny. They were exhausted, their spirits crushed. Are you made of iron, Odysseus? Eurydice argued. We need to rest. Let us land for just one night. What harm can one night do? Odysseus saw he was outnumbered. He reluctantly agreed, but only after making them all swear a solemn oath that they would not touch the sacred cattle. They all swore readily. They made their camp. But that night, a great storm arose, and for an entire month, the winds blew relentlessly, trapping them on the island. Their food ran out. They grew desperate with hunger, forced to hunt for birds and fish, but it was never enough. One day, Odysseus went inland by himself to pray, and the gods cast a deep sleep upon him. While he was gone, Eurydice gathered the starving men. "Listen," he said. "To die of starvation is the most miserable death of all. Let's make a sacrifice of the best cattle to the gods. If they're pleased, they may forgive us. And if the sun god is angry, I'd rather die at sea in one moment than waste away slowly here." The men's hunger was stronger than their fear. They went to the fields, slaughtered the finest cattle, and began to feast. At that moment, Odysseus awoke. As he drew near the camp, the smell of roasting meat reached him. He knew at once what had happened and let out a cry of despair. Helios, the sun god, was filled with rage. He went before Zeus and demanded vengeance. "Father Zeus," he cried, "you must punish them. If they are not punished, I will go down to Hades and shine among the dead." Zeus assured him that justice would be done. Back on the island, strange omens began to appear. The hides of the slaughtered cattle began to crawl, and the meat on the spits let out moans like live cows. For 6 days, the men continued to feast, trying to ignore the terrifying signs. On the 7th day, the storm finally broke. Eager to escape, they boarded their ship and set sail. But they hadn't gone far when the sky suddenly darkened. A bolt of lightning from Zeus struck the ship. It shattered, and all his men were thrown into the churning sea and drowned. Odysseus alone survived, clinging to the broken mast and keel, which he lashed together to make a small raft. He was now utterly alone, adrift on a vast and vengeful sea. The island of the Nympha storm that destroyed his ship now turned against Odysseus, blowing him back towards the dreadful strait. As dawn broke, he found himself at the mouth of Charybdis's whirlpool, as it began its terrifying inhalation. His raft was sucked into the abyss. Desperately, he made a great leap and clung to the roots of a wild fig tree growing out of the cliff face, dangling over the void. He waited. Finally, with a thunderous roar, Charybdis spewed the sea back up. The timbers of his raft shot to the surface. Odysseus dropped into the water and scrambled back onto his makeshift vessel, paddling away with his hands. For 9 days he drifted. On the 10th night, he washed ashore on the island of Ogygia. This beautiful, tranquil island would become his prison. Ogygia was the home of the nymph Calypso, a goddess of stunning beauty. She found the shipwrecked Odysseus, nursed him back to health, and fell deeply in love with him. Her island was a paradise of eternal spring. She offered him everything, even immortality. If he stayed and became her husband, he would never grow old or die. For a time, Odysseus was grateful. He became Calypso's lover, and the days passed in a peaceful haze. But the island, for all its beauty, was not home. The comfort she offered couldn't erase the deep, aching longing in his heart for Ithaca, for his wife, and for the son he barely knew. Every day, he would walk to the shore and sit on the rocks, staring out at the empty sea, weeping with homesickness. He was a captive of comfort, a prisoner in paradise. 7 long years passed this way. Meanwhile, on Mount Olympus, the goddess Athena had not forgotten him. She pleaded with Zeus for Odysseus's release. Zeus agreed that Odysseus had suffered enough. He commanded his messenger, Hermes, to fly to Ogygia and order Calypso to release him. Hermes delivered the message. Calypso was heartbroken and angry. "You gods are cruel," she cried. "I saved him, I cared for him, and I offered him eternal life. Why must I give him up?" But she knew she could not defy Zeus. With a heavy heart, she went to find Odysseus on the shore. "Unhappy man," she said gently, "you may stop your grieving. I will help you leave." Odysseus was suspicious, but she swore an oath she meant no harm. For 4 days, they worked together. She gave him a great bronze axe, and he built a wide, sturdy raft. On the 5th day, it was ready. Calypso gave him supplies and sent a fair wind to speed him on his way. Odysseus set sail, his heart a mixture of joy and apprehension. For 17 days he sailed, but his enemy, Poseidon, had not forgotten. Seeing the raft, he stirred up a terrible storm. A huge wave shattered the mast, and Odysseus was washed overboard. The raft was breaking apart. Just then, a sea nymph named Ino saw his plight. She landed on his raft in the form of a seabird. "Poor man," she said, "take this veil. Tie it around your waist. It will protect you. Abandon your raft and swim for shore." As his raft disintegrated, he tied the magical veil around his waist and plunged into the sea. For 2 days and 2 nights, he swam. Finally, he saw land, but the shore was a wall of jagged cliffs. Just as he was about to be dashed against the rocks, Athena put a thought into his mind. He swam along the coast until he found the mouth of a calm river. He prayed to the river god, who checked his current, allowing Odysseus to swim into the fresh water and crawl ashore, exhausted. He untied the veil and threw it back into the river, turning his head away. He found a thicket of 2 olive trees, burrowed into a deep pile of leaves, and fell into a profound, death-like sleep. The princess and the Phaeacians while Odysseus slept. Athena went to the palace of King Alcinous and entered the dreams of his young daughter, Princess Nazirite. Appearing as a friend, Athena chided her for leaving her fine clothes unwashed, suggesting she go down to the river the next morning to do laundry. When Nausicaa awoke, she asked her father to borrow a wagon. She and her maids traveled to the river, washed the clothes, and spread them on the shore to dry. While they waited, they bathed and then played a game with a ball. When Nausicaa threw the ball wide, it landed in the river, and the maids shrieked. The sound woke Odysseus. "What land have I come to now?" he wondered. Hearing the female voices, he decided to show himself. He was a terrifying sight, naked, caked in dried brine, a tangled mess. He broke off a leafy branch to cover himself and emerged from the thicket. Like a wild animal, the handmaidens screamed and scattered. Only Nausicaa stood her ground, given courage by Athena. Odysseus, seeing her courage, decided against clasping her knees to beg for help. Instead, he stood at a distance and spoke with gentle words. "I beseech you, princess. Are you a goddess or a mortal? I have never seen anyone so lovely. I am in awe." He briefly told her of his plight and begged for help. Nausicaa was moved. "Stranger," she replied, her voice kind, "you do not seem a bad man, though you have clearly suffered. You will not lack for clothes or anything else a supplicant needs." She called her maids back. "Come back. This is not an enemy. He is a poor, shipwrecked man. We must care for him." They gave him a tunic and cloak. After he had washed, Athena enhanced his appearance, making him look taller and more handsome. When he walked back towards the princess, she was astonished. He looked like a god. She told him to follow her wagon, but to wait in a sacred grove outside the city. She worried about gossip if she was seen with a handsome stranger. Once she was home, he was to enter the city, find the palace, and go straight to her mother, Queen Arete. "If you can win my mother's sympathy," she said, "you can be sure you will see your home again." Odysseus did as she said. He entered the palace, shrouded in a mist cast by Athena, until he reached the king and queen. He fell to his knees and clasped the queen's legs. The mist dissolved. The court was stunned. Odysseus begged for a ship to take him home. Later that evening, Queen Arete, recognizing the clothes he was wearing as her own weaving, questioned him. Odysseus told them the story of his 7 years with Calypso and his encounter with Nazirite. The king and queen, impressed, promised him a ship home the very next day. They held a feast, and their bard sang of the Trojan War when he sang of the Trojan horse. Odysseus's own idea, the hero could not hold back his tears. The king noticed his guest's distress and asked him to reveal his true identity. And so Odysseus told them everything. He recounted all his adventures since leaving Troy. The Phaeacians listened, spellbound, late into the night. The next day, true to their word, they provided a ship. The journey was miraculously swift. As Odysseus slept peacefully on the deck, they arrived at Ithaca just before dawn. The crew gently carried the sleeping hero ashore, laid him on the sand with his treasures, and then sailed for home. His 10-year voyage was finally over. The stranger in Ithaca, Odysseus, awoke on a shore that felt both familiar and strange. Athena had shrouded the island in mist, so he didn't recognize his own home. He felt a pang of despair, believing the Phaeacians had abandoned him. Just then, Athena appeared, disguised as a young shepherd. Ever cautious, Odysseus didn't reveal his identity, inventing a long story about being a fugitive. Athena smiled at his cunning and revealed her true form. "You are a master of tales," she said. "But there is no need. You are home. This is Ithaca." She dispelled the mist. Odysseus saw it all clearly. The familiar harbor, the rugged hills. He fell to his knees and kissed the soil of his homeland, tears of joy streaming down his face. He was home, but Athena warned him his troubles weren't over. His palace was filled with over 100 arrogant suitors who believed him dead. They were devouring his wealth and demanding his wife. Penelope, choose one of them. Penelope had held them off by weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father, but secretly unraveling it each night. Now, the suitors were growing impatient and plotting to kill his son. Telemach. It was too dangerous for Odysseus to simply walk into his palace. Athena disguised him. With a touch of her wand, she transformed him into an old, forgotten vagrant, dressing him in filthy rags and giving him a beggar's staff. First, she instructed him to go to the hut of his loyal swineherd. Eumaeus didn't recognize his master, but he welcomed the old beggar kindly, speaking with great sadness of the king he still served. While there, Athena guided Telemachus safely back to Ithaca, directing him to the swineherd's hut. And so it was in that humble place that father and son were reunited after 20 years. At first, Telemachus thought he was a god, but Odysseus convinced him, and they embraced. Weeping with joy, together they began to plot their revenge. Odysseus would return to the palace as the beggar to test the servants and see the suitors. Telemachus would go ahead and remove all the weapons from the great hall. The next day, as Odysseus approached his palace gates, a very old dog on a dung heap lifted its head. It was Argos, the dog Odysseus had raised as a puppy. For 20 years, the faithful dog had waited. Now he recognized his master. He wagged his tail feebly, but didn't have the strength to stand. Odysseus turned his head to hide a tear. As he passed into the palace, Argos, having finally seen his master one last time, let out a final breath and died. Inside, Odysseus was met with scorn. The suitors, led by the arrogant Antinous, mocked and abused him. Antinous even threw a footstool at him. Odysseus endured it all, his heart burning with a quiet, cold rage. Penelope heard the commotion and asked to speak with the beggar, hoping for news. It took all his self-control not to reveal himself. He told her a clever story of how he had once met Odysseus, describing his clothes and the golden brooch so perfectly that Penelope wept. Convinced, she treated the old man with kindness and ordered her old maid, Euryclea, who had been Odysseus's nurse, to wash his feet. As the old woman washed his feet, her hands traced a familiar scar on his thigh from a boar hunt. Her eyes widened in shock. She looked up to cry out his name, but Odysseus quickly grabbed her. Silence. If you love me, do not breathe a word. The loyal nurse, weeping with joy, kept his secret. The time for vengeance was drawing near. The stringing of the bow of the day of reckoning had arrived. Penelope announced a contest. She brought out the great bow of Odysseus, a weapon so strong only he had ever been able to string it, and 12 iron axe heads. Whoever, she declared, can string this bow and shoot an arrow straight through the 12 axe heads, him I will marry. One by one, the suitors tried. They warmed the bow, rubbed it with tallow, but none could even bend it. The hall filled with their frustrated curses. While they struggled, Odysseus slipped out and revealed himself to 2 loyal servants, the swineherd Eumaeus and the cowherd Philoetius. They wept with joy and swore to fight with him. He ordered Eumaeus to bring him the bow and Philoetius to lock the outer gates. Odysseus returned to the hall as the last suitor failed. "Allow me," he said humbly, "to try my hand. I'd like to see if I still have the strength of my youth." The suitors erupted in mocking laughter. But Penelope intervened. "It is not right to be so rude. Let him try." Telemachus then asserted his authority, sending his mother to her chambers. Eumaeus brought the bow to Odysseus. He handled it with easy familiarity. Then, without any apparent effort, he strung it. The string hummed like a swallow's song. The suitors' faces went pale. Zeus sent a crash of thunder from a clear sky. Odysseus smiled. He picked up an arrow and, still sitting, drew it back and released. It flew straight and true through all 12 axe heads. He turned to his son. "Telemachus, your guest has not disgraced you." He stood and threw off his rags. The king of Ithaca stood before them, terrible in his wrath. "The contest is over," he roared. "Now for another kind of target." He aimed his next arrow at Antinous, who was lifting a golden cup. The arrow struck him in the throat. He fell backward, dead. Panic erupted. The suitors looked for weapons, but Telemachus had removed them all. They were trapped and unarmed. "You dogs," Odysseus bellowed. "You thought I would never return. You devoured my house and courted my wife while I was still alive. Now you will all pay." He and Telemachus, joined by their 2 loyal servants, began their terrible work. Arrows flew. When they were gone, they took up swords and shields. The great hall became a place of slaughter. With Athena fighting invisibly by their side, they brought down every last suitor. When it was over, Euryclea, the nurse, ran to Penelope's chambers. But Penelope could not believe it. She came down to the hall and saw her husband, but held back, her heart torn between hope and disbelief. After 20 years, he looked like a stranger. "Let your mother test me," Odysseus said with a smile. "She will know me soon enough." After he had bathed and dressed in fresh robes, he returned, but she was still silent. Then Penelope decided on one final test, a secret only the 2 of them could know. She turned to a servant. "Move the master's bed out of our chamber and prepare it for him in the hall." This was the test. Odysseus's expression changed. "Woman," he exclaimed, "who has moved my bed? I built that bed myself, around the trunk of a living olive tree. I built our entire chamber around it. It cannot be moved." At these words, Penelope's defenses finally crumbled. This was the secret sign. Tears streamed down her face as she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "Do not be angry with me," she wept. "I had to guard my heart for so long, but now I know. It is really you." And so the king and queen were finally, truly reunited. They held each other and talked long into the night, sharing the stories of their long years apart. Peace had returned to the house and to their hearts. The long voyage was over. Odysseus was home. The great hall is quiet now. The long-suffering king has been restored to his throne, his faithful queen by his side. A profound sense of stillness settles over the land. The storms have passed. The monsters are a distant memory. The journey is complete. Like Odysseus, your own long day's journey is now at its end. There are no more trials to face tonight, no more seas to cross. There is only the quiet harbor of your bed, the calm stillness of this room. The longing for rest has been fulfilled. Allow the story to fade, like a ship sailing over the horizon, leaving behind only the gentle, rhythmic sound of the waves. The story has been told, and now it is time for your mind to be still. It is time to let go of the journey and to sink into the deep, peaceful slumber that awaits you. Feel the weight of your body, heavy and relaxed. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your own breath, a steady tide pulling you deeper and deeper into rest. There is nothing left to do, nothing left to think. The hero is home, and you are home in your bed. It is time to dream away. Good night and sweet dreams. Settle in now. Find that comfortable space and let the world outside just begin to fade away. Close your eyes and take a slow, deep breath. Inhale peace and exhale the day. Tonight, we're going to travel to a world of myth and music, to witness a love so strong it dared to challenge death itself. Let's follow Orpheus, the master of the lyre, on his journey into the shadows to bring back his beloved Eurydice. As you drift towards sleep, just feel the weight of that single, fragile condition for her return. He must not look back. Now, let the journey begin. A world of love and light. Before the shadows, there was light. Before the silence, there was a song that drifted through the hills and valleys of Thrace. A song so pure and perfect that the world itself would pause to listen. This was the music of Orpheus. They said he was the son of Apollo, the god of music, and the muse Calliope, and if you heard his voice, you wouldn't doubt the divine blood in his veins. His lyre, a gift from Apollo, was like an extension of his soul. Its 7 strings weren't just plucked. They were coaxed into life by his gentle fingers. When Orpheus played, a hush would fall over the land. The busy chirping of birds would soften. The rustling leaves of ancient oaks would still their dance. Even the rocks and stones seemed to lean in closer, as if they too had hearts that could be moved. Wild animals, the fierce lion, the shy deer would forget their nature and lie down together in a peaceable kingdom at his feet. His music wasn't just sound, it was the language of creation itself, a force that could soothe savagery and remind all living things of the beauty at the heart of the world. In this world of harmony, Orpheus found his own heart's match. Her name was Eurydice, a wood nymph whose grace made the wildflowers seem clumsy. She wasn't drawn to him by his fame, but by the pure, honest soul she heard in his music. While others were mesmerized by his gift, she heard the quiet longing, the gentle joy, the deep well of feeling from which each note was drawn. They first met in a sun-dappled grove, where light filtered through the trees. Eurydice was dancing with a flutter of butterflies, her laughter as light as their wings. Orpheus, resting beneath a great oak, watched her, and for the first time his music fell silent. In her, he saw a living song. When her eyes finally met his soul recognized her instantly. From that day on, they were inseparable. His music, already beautiful, became something more. It now carried the warmth of her smile, the gentleness of her touch. He played for her, weaving melodies that told the story of their growing love. They'd spend long, golden afternoons in the meadows, his head in her lap as he strummed his lyre. Theirs was a love born of perfect harmony, a seamless joining of art and nature. It was inevitable they would marry. Their wedding day was a festival of light and sound, blessed by Hymenaios, the god of marriage. All of nature seemed to celebrate with them. Orpheus played a song of pure, unadulterated joy, a promise of a lifetime together. Eurydice, radiant, danced as he played. For one perfect, fleeting moment, it seemed their happiness would last forever. But in the world of gods and mortals, even the most perfect happiness is fragile. A short time after their wedding, tragedy struck. On a warm afternoon, Eurydice was wandering through a meadow. In some tellings of the story, she was dancing. In others, she was fleeing the unwanted advances of a shepherd named Eurystheus. Whatever the reason, as she moved through the tall grass, she didn't see the viper coiled in the shade. The snake struck her ankle. A single cry escaped her lips, and then there was only silence. She fell, the life fading from her eyes like a candle flame in a sudden gust of wind. When Orpheus found her, the world lost its color. The vibrant meadow seemed a dull, flat gray. He saw her lying among the flowers, so still and beautiful. The lyre, the source of all his magic, slipped from his grasp. For the first time, there was no music. There was only a profound, crushing silence. His grief was a storm that shook the world. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He did nothing but wander the hills where they had once walked together, whispering her name. When at last he picked up his lyre again, the music he made was so full of sorrow it brought tears to the eyes of gods and mortals. The rivers overflowed with weeping, and the nymphs and dryads of the forest mourned with him. The world had learned of his grief, a sorrow so absolute it seemed to stain the very fabric of existence. A descent into shadow days bled into weeks. The world above had lost all meaning for Orpheus, but grief, in its deepest form, can sometimes curdle into a strange and desperate resolve. A plan began to form in his mind, both audacious and impossible. If the world of the living no longer held his love, then he would follow her into the world of the dead. He would descend into the underworld. No mortal had ever made such a journey and returned. But Orpheus was armed with his music. Driven by a love that refused to accept death's finality, he set out to do the impossible. He found the entrance in a dark cavern where the sunlight dared not go. Taking a deep breath of the living world's air, he stepped across the threshold. His lyre clutched in his hand like a single torch against the darkness. The path spiraled down into an oppressive gloom. Soon, he came to the banks of a vast, dark river. The river Styx, the boundary between life and death. There stood Charon, the ancient ferryman, whose duty was to carry the dead but deny the living. Only the dead may pass. His voice rasped. Orpheus didn't offer a coin. He raised his lyre. A melody of profound longing filled the stagnant air. He sang of his love for Eurydice, of the sunlight in her hair, of the emptiness of his world without her. The music washed over the grim ferryman, and for the first time in his eternal, joyless existence, Charon felt something stir. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek. Without a word, he beckoned Orpheus onto the ferry. On the other side, another guardian waited. Cerberus, the monstrous, three-headed dog, whose growl was a low thunder. As it lunged, Orpheus began to play again. Not a song of sorrow, but a gentle, soothing lullaby. The great beast paused, its ferocious growls softening. One by one, the three massive heads drooped. The 6 burning eyes grew heavy, and the monstrous dog sank to the ground, its snores soon echoing through the cavern. Orpheus stepped past the sleeping guardian, his music having tamed the untamable. He journeyed on, deeper into the realm of shades. He walked through the fields of asphodel, where the souls of ordinary people drifted like smoke. As Orpheus passed among them, playing his lyre, the shades stirred. They turned their vacant eyes toward the music, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of memory seemed to return to them. His journey took him past Tartarus, the place of eternal punishment. He saw the shade of Sisyphus, forever pushing his boulder. He saw Tantalus, trapped in a pool he could never drink from. As Orpheus's sorrowful music drifted into that place, a miracle happened. Sisyphus paused and rested against his great stone. The Furies, the winged goddesses of vengeance, found their cheeks wet with tears they didn't know they could shed. The entire machinery of eternal punishment ground to a halt. Captivated by the song of a mortal's love, finally he reached the heart of the underworld. There, upon a throne of blackest jet, sat Hades, the grim king of the dead, and beside him his queen Persephone. Orpheus knelt before them and let his music speak for him. He played his most powerful song, telling the story of his life, his love, his unbearable loss. He sang of Eurydice so vividly that even the shadowy gods could see her dancing in the meadow. His voice wasn't demanding, but a pure, honest plea. An appeal not to the laws of the underworld, but to the hearts of its rulers. The effect was profound. The cold heart of Hades, a king never before swayed, was moved to compassion. Persephone, her eyes filled with sorrow, turned to her husband in a silent appeal for mercy. A deep, resonant voice finally broke the spell. "You have moved us, mortal," Hades said. "You may have her back." A wave of overwhelming joy washed over Orpheus. He had done it. But Hades' voice boomed. "There is one condition." The king leaned forward. "She will follow you out of the darkness. You must walk ahead and lead the way. But you must not, under any circumstances, look back at her. Not until you are both fully in the light of the sun. If you turn to look even a moment too soon, she will be lost to you forever." It was a simple rule, yet a terrible test of fate. Thinking it a small price, Orpheus eagerly agreed. He thanked the gods and turned his back on the throne, ready to begin the long journey home. His beloved Eurydice just a few steps behind him in the shadows. A fateful glance, the journey back was a different kind of torment. The path of ascent was steep, treacherous, and wrapped in a darkness even deeper than before. Orpheus walked with a determined pace, his heart a drumbeat of anticipation. Behind him, there was only silence. He strained his ears for the sound of her footsteps, for any sign she was truly there. But the shades of the dead move without a sound. He heard nothing but the pounding of his own blood and the scuff of his sandals. The silence began to work on him. A small, cold seed of doubt began to sprout. What if the gods had tricked him? Was he walking alone, leading nothing but a phantom? The thought was agony. He clutched his lyre but couldn't play, his focus entirely on the suffocating silence behind him. The path grew steeper. The longing to turn to just glance over his shoulder for a fraction of a second became an almost physical ache. He could almost feel her presence. But was it real or just his own desperate hope? He tried to reason with himself. Hades had given his word, but the underworld was a place of shadows. Trust felt like a currency for the living, worthless down here. His faith was beginning to crumble under the pressure of his love and fear. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint gray light far ahead. The exit, hope, surged through him. They were almost there. Just a few more steps, and the sun would be on their faces. He would hold her again. He quickened his pace, eyes fixed on the growing light. He stepped out of the darkness, and onto the soil of the upper world. The warmth of the sun, the scent of pine, the sound of a distant birdlet was overwhelming. He had made it, but had she, in that single catastrophic moment, standing at the very threshold of life and death, his doubt and love crested into an unbearable wave. He had to know, he had to see her. The god's warning, his own promise, it all evaporated in the blinding, human need for certainty. Slowly, his heart breaking, he turned around. She was there, only a few feet behind him, still in the gloom of the cave's entrance, her form just beginning to solidify from a shade back into a woman. He saw her face, pale and beautiful, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. A faint smile touched her lips as she saw him, but it was too soon. He had looked back while she was still in the shadows. As he reached for her, she began to fade. Her form grew transparent, her edges blurring back into the darkness. She was being pulled back. She stretched out her arms, and a single, whispered word reached him, softer than the wind, farewell. And then, she was gone. He was left alone in the bright, unforgiving sunlight, his hand outstretched to an empty space. A cry of pure anguish tore from his throat, a sound with no music in it. He had lost her again, not to fate, but to his own deeply human flaw, his inability to trust in the face of overwhelming love and doubt. He tried to go back, but the way was barred. Corin would not answer his calls. He sat at the riverbank for 7 days and nights, nourished only by his grief, but the gates of the underworld remained shut. No mortal could enter the realm of Hades twice while still alive. He returned to the world above, a ghost among the living. He shunned all company, his music now a private, unending conversation with his grief. He rejected all other women, his heart belonging forever to the shade he had lost a second and final time. His end came years later. As the legends tell it, a group of Maenads, frenzied followers of the god Dionysus, found him singing his mournful songs. Angered by his rejection of all women in his fidelity to Eurydice, they fell upon him. Orpheus, lost in his sorrow, welcomed death's release. They tore him limb from limb. His head and his lyre were thrown into a river, but even in death, the magic didn't fade. His head, floating toward the sea, continued to sing a final, heartbreaking lament for his lost Eurydice. The Muses found his remains and gave them a proper burial, and it's said that nightingales sang more sweetly over his grave than anywhere else in the world. The gods, in tribute to his gift, placed his lyre in the heavens, where it remains as a constellation. But the story doesn't truly end there, for his soul, now free, descended one last time into the underworld. He didn't need his music now. He was no longer a visitor. He walked the familiar, shadowy paths until he came to the peaceful meadows of the Elysian fields, the final resting place for the heroic and virtuous Dot, and there, waiting for him, was Eurydice Dot at last. They were reunited with no conditions, no tests, and no fear of looking back. They walk there still in the quiet fields of eternity, sometimes side by side, sometimes with him leading and her following, free to turn and gaze upon each other's face whenever they please. Their love finally beyond the reach of fate, doubt and death itself, and now Sleep well.